No one was ever meant to uncover this. The receipt was a phantom, a fragile, time-stained scrap of paper hidden deep within the binding of an 1849 tax ledger. It lay buried for nearly 2 centuries, kept silent by dust and neglect. Until now, on the heavy, humid morning of April 11th in Augustine Parish, Louisiana, a transaction occurred that history was designed to forget. A boy of 19 was sold on the courthouse steps. His supposed crime was never written down. The price is 17. A widow named Maeve O'Donnell bought him that day. She was new to the country, her husband taken by fever the year before, and she needed help tending her failing patch of land. To her, the young man was nothing more than a cheap laborer, another casualty of misfortune. She counted out 17 copper pennies, signed the deed with an unsteady X, and led him away. She never knew that his true name wasn't Kalin. She never knew the accusation against him was a fabrication, a cruel performance. And she certainly never knew who he had secretly married only 3 months earlier. How does a story like this disappear? What truths were we never meant to uncover? The evidence wasn't just buried in the archives. It was deliberately erased by a man who had the authority to twist reality itself. He didn't merely want the boy destroyed. He wanted him erased, reduced to a footnote on a slip of paper worth 17 cents. A life valued less than a handful of nails. The silence that followed wasn't coincidence. It was constructed. The architect of that silence was Judge Alistair Finch. In Augustine Parish, his words didn't just carry the weight of law. They were gospel. A man hewn from swamp stone and arrogance. His family had ruled the parish's courts and coffers for 3 generations. His control was absolute, not because of his vast land holdings, but because he dictated the very meaning of truth. He presided over the court, appointed the sheriff, and held mortgages on half the town. To oppose him was to risk obliteration. He could erase a man's name from the voting rolls, dissolve his credit, seize his property under some forgotten clause. Judge Finch wasn't merely powerful. He was omnipotent within his domain, a monarch ruling a kingdom of submission. Kalin had been one of his possessions. Not born into his estate, but purchased years before from a trader passing through from Virginia. The boy was quiet, perceptive, unnervingly intelligent, qualities that both unsettled and intrigued the judge. Finch saw him not as human, but as a rare and fascinating specimen. He had Kalin secretly educated, taught him letters, arithmetic, even fragments of French. It was a whim, a game of control. The judge took pleasure in owning what no one else could, a mind he believed he'd molded himself. But an awakened mind cannot be contained. Kalin began to see the world, and the truth, in ways the judge could never predict. That clarity led him to the one person in Augustine Parish he was never meant to look upon as an equal. Among the coastal Gullah communities, whispers still linger of shadow marriages, hidden unions between the enslaved and the powerful, bound not by law but by older, deeper vows. Dangerous secrets that, if revealed, could collapse the order of that society. This story is one of those whispers. Kalin's tasks eventually brought him to the Finch estate, a grand mansion with white columns and silence thick as judgment. He was assigned to the library, a vast chamber filled with books from Paris and London, and there he met her, Genevieve Finch, the judge's only daughter. She was 17, pale and distant, educated yet imprisoned, surrounded by luxury but suffocated by expectation. Promised to a senator's son from Baton Rouge, her future was already sold. Genevieve had her father's intellect but none of his cruelty. She saw in Kalin not a servant, not a possession, but the only soul in her world who truly seemed awake. Their conversations began as whispers exchanged between the rows of Voltaire and Shakespeare. He spoke of stars, she spoke of oceans. He taught her constellations from African skies. She read him poems from forbidden pages. 2 prisoners, one gilded, one chained, finding freedom only in each other's words within that confinement. Something forbidden yet breathtaking began to bloom. It was a love both doomed and undeniable, a feeling that could only ever end in tragedy. They both understood it, yet understanding didn't stop their hearts. Their stolen hours grew longer, their whispers heavier with meaning, until the quiet of the library itself felt alive, trembling with the weight of what they dared to feel. This wasn't merely affection. It was defiance, a quiet revolution of the soul. In the dead of winter, beneath the bare limbs of a 3-century-old oak, they made their vow. They knew no priest would stand for them, No law would recognize what they were about to do. So they sought out a woman who lived where the land dissolved into swamp. An old healer named Elizabeth, keeper of ancient traditions older than the parish, older even than the nation. By the dim glow of a single candle, with vows whispered in a mix of English and a language the judge would have dismissed as superstition, they bound themselves to one another. For a handful of precious weeks, they lived as husband and wife, a kingdom of two, built on secrecy and fragile joy. But in Augustine Parish, secrets of short lives, a misplaced book, a look held too long, a note discovered by a loyal servant. However it happened, the details of Judge Finch's discovery were lost to time, but the eruption of his wrath became legend. His anger wasn't loud or wild, it was cold, deliberate, suffocating, a fury that drained the air from any room he entered. He never shouted, never accused. He simply began to move his pieces. His first moved Genevieve. She was locked away in her chambers, stripped of her books and letters, her world shrinking until the only thing left within it was her father's unrelenting gaze. He spoke to her in a calm, level voice, telling her she had shamed her family, her name, her faith. He called her sick, corrupted by some fever of the mind, and promised to make her well. It was not discipline. It was psychological destruction. Then came his second move, the one meant for Calin. Finch understood that killing the boy would be too easy, too merciful. Death was final. He wanted something slower. He intended to erase Calin completely. Not just the man, but the idea of him. He wanted Genevieve's memory to curdle into humiliation. So the judge devised a cruel masterpiece. He took a small silver locket, one he had once given his daughter as a child, and planted it in Calin's modest quarters. The sheriff, whose entire career depended on Finch's favor, discovered the stolen trinket soon after. Theft was common enough, but theft from the Finch family was unforgivable. Calin was torn from his bed before dawn and dragged away. He never saw Genevieve again. For 2 endless weeks, he was confined in the parish jail, a damp stone cell where the darkness itself seemed to whisper his defeat. He was not beaten. He was not whipped. Finch's cruelty had evolved beyond that. Calin was simply abandoned in silence, left to face his own despair and the crawling scrape of rats in the dark. When the charge was finally read aloud, theft of property valued at $20. The punishment was immediate and lawful sale at public auction. It was a perfect lie, written in elegant, merciless ink by the judge himself. Finch wasn't just punishing a man. He was revising history, erasing the parts of it that dared to contradict him. The auction was set for April 11th. That morning the air hung heavy with heat, thick with the promise of rain. A small crowd gathered at the courthouse lawn. Farmers, traders, men with tired faces and sharp eyes, there for routine transactions, a seized cotton gin, a few heads of livestock. Calin was the final item. He was led out in irons, his hands bound before him. He had been washed and dressed neatly. An order from Finch himself. The judge didn't want him to appear as a field laborer, but as something refined, something that had fallen from grace. The auctioneer Bartholomew, a man whose debts were deep in the judge's ledger, began the sale. He did not list Calin's talents or education. He recited only the accusation and the judgment. Then, he called for the opening bid. The court sets the price. The auctioneer barked, his voice trembling under the weight of the heat and the moment. 17 cents. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. 17 cents. It wasn't just low, it was absurd. An able young man, even one accused of theft, was worth hundreds, sometimes more. Such a price meant one of two things: either the man was dying, or something else entirely was unfolding, something calculated. The wiser among them recognized it instantly. This wasn't a sale, it was a message. A public act of humiliation, scripted by power and performed before witnesses. To place a bid would be to intrude upon the designs of Judge Finch, and no one in Augustine Parish dared to do that. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down like humidity before a storm. And then, through that oppressive quiet, a woman's voice broke through. Maeve O'Donnell, a widow, her life carved by loss, stepped forward. She didn't understand the game being played. She didn't sense the invisible boundaries that governed this place. All she saw was a boy standing alone, and a price she could actually pay. Her husband's death had left her with 3 acres of failing soil and mounting debt. 17 cents for another pair of hands seemed like survival. Clutching her shawl close despite the sweltering air, she pushed through the crowd. "I'll take him," she said, her voice small but steady. 17 cents. Bartholomew, the auctioneer, froze. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He glanced toward the courthouse window, knowing the judge was watching from above. Kalin was never meant to be sold. He was meant to stand there, unsold and unwanted, and be quietly sent to the parish work camp, a death sentence by another name. But the widow's bid was public and lawful. To deny it would be to violate the very justice Judge Finch claimed to embody. Sweat gathered on Bartholomew's brow as he stammered, 17 cents from the widow. His eyes swept the crowd, pleading silently for someone to speak, to bid to intervene. But no one moved. Every face mirrored the same dread and pity. They understood what she didn't. This wasn't a purchase, it was a curse. "Going once?" he called, his voice unsteady. "Going twice." He hesitated, giving fate one last chance to undo the mistake. Nothing. Only the shrill, relentless cry of cicadas filled the pause. "Sold," he croaked at last, slamming his gavel down with a hollow final crack. "To the widow O'Donnell. For 17 cents. Maeve's fingers trembled as she counted out the coins, the metal clinking faintly against Bartholomew's sweating palm. A clerk, pale and eager to be done, scribbled out the deed in near panic. Maeve signed with an unsteady X. It was over. She had just purchased a man for less than the cost of a spool of thread. As she led Kalin down the courthouse steps, he didn't look at her. His gaze lifted to the second-story window, the one where Finch stood watching. For an instant, their eyes met across the square. The judge's look was one of cold satisfaction. A silent declaration, "Look at what I've made of you." Kalin's eyes, however, burned with something else entirely. Not despair, not hatred. Something deeper, more dangerous. A promise. Maeve saw none of it. She was only a wary widow making a desperate choice, unaware that she had just inherited a secret powerful enough to shatter a town. She had taken home a man who was once a husband, to the daughter of the most powerful man in Louisiana. And in the dim, dust-filled stillness of her small cabin, the air itself seemed to whisper a truth as old as cruelty. The most vicious lies are told in silence. Maeve didn't quite know what to make of Kalin. He wasn't rebellious, but he wasn't really there either. He worked from dawn until dusk, turning the stubborn clay soil with a mechanical precision that bordered on eerie. Every command she gave, he followed without hesitation. His obedience was so complete it unsettled her. Yet he rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were sparse and hollow, like echoes from somewhere far away. His eyes, always distant, seemed fixed on a world no one else could see. She tried to reach him. One afternoon, she asked about his past. "I was in service, ma'am," he said quietly. When she asked if he had a family, he only shook his head. After that, the silence between them thickened, heavier even than the sticky summer air that hung outside the cabin walls. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was dense, filled with all the things neither dared to voice. Maeve was a simple woman, pious, practical, gentle. Slavery to her had always been something far away, a distant cruelty belonging to the grand plantations and wealthy families. Now it sat across from her at her rough, hewn table, breathing, working, existing, and she didn't know what to do with it. She began to watch him when she thought he wouldn't notice. His hands, though hardened now by labor, weren't the hands of a field worker. They were long, deft, more suited to books or quills than plows. Even his posture carried a strange grace, a quiet dignity that felt out of place in her little patch of earth. One night, unable to sleep, she saw him outside beneath the stars. His lips were moving, soundless. For a moment, she thought he was praying. Then she realized he was naming the constellations. Meanwhile, Judge Finch's fury festered like a wound that refused to heal. The widow's bid had ruined the perfect symmetry of his vengeance. Kalin was supposed to vanish into the endless misery of the parish work camp, erased from the world. Instead, he was alive, just 2 miles away, a living reminder of his daughter's defiance. Each day that Kalin breathed was an insult to the judge's power. So Finch began to tighten the noose in quieter ways. He ordered the sheriff to patrol past the O'Donnell farm twice a day, a show of authority meant to unsettle. He leaned on the storekeeper in town, telling him to cut off Maeve's credit, hoping hardship would drive her to sell the boy. But Maeve was stubborn, and the poor farmers around her, people who feared the judge but despised him more, began to help in secret. A sack of cornmeal left at her door, a few jars of peaches, a quiet rebellion of small mercies. Finch's patience fractured. He couldn't simply have Callan killed, not openly. It had to be done silently, cleanly. He needed someone who worked in the spaces between law and shadow. And eventually, he found him. A man named Rut, a swamp tracker known only by reputation. People whispered that he had talents that didn't belong to ordinary men. Rut was a hunter of the lost, a man who could find anyone and make them disappear for the right price. Back at the farm, things began to change in subtle, careful ways. Callan, aware that the judge's gaze still reached for him from afar, decided to show Maeve a glimpse of who he really was. It was a risk, but a necessary one. One evening he found her at the table, frowning over her late husband's ledger. She could handle numbers, but not words. Quietly, he stepped forward. "May I help, ma'am?" he asked. Taking the book from her hands, he sorted through the pages with calm precision, rewriting the figures into order. His penmanship was smooth, elegant, startlingly refined. Maeve stared at the page, then at him. "Where did you learn to do that?" she breathed. The judge valued certain talents. Callan replied, and for the first time, there was a trace of irony in his tone. After that, he began to help in other ways. Repairing tools she thought ruined, showing her how to channel water through the dry fields more efficiently. He wasn't just surviving, he was rebuilding. Slowly, a connection began to take root between them. Not friendship, not yet, but something quiet and real, the wordless bond of two souls fighting the same indifferent world. Maeve no longer saw him as a cheap laborer bought for 17 cents. She began to see the depth behind his silence, the gravity of a man shaped by extraordinary pain and intellect. And that realization chilled her. Whatever crime he had been accused of, whatever had brought the wrath of Judge Finch upon him, it couldn't have been ordinary. She understood then, she wasn't just sheltering a man, she was protecting a secret. And in Augustine Parish, secrets always demanded a price. An old parish diary described it best, saw the judge's man, Rut, in town today. He don't walk like other men. He moves like the water, quiet and coiled. When Maeve returned, the horizon was beginning to pale with the first grey light of dawn. The book felt like it was burning a hole through her apron. She hid it beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fit it through the gap. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She had done it. Whatever it was done. There was no going back. Outside, the first sounds of morning began to rise. The distant call of a whip-poor-will, the low rustle of the wind through the cane. It was a new day, but it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. When Callan came in from the barn, he looked different. He didn't ask, didn't speak. But the look in his eyes told her he knew. He simply nodded once, a gesture small and heavy with meaning, and went about his work. The rhythm of their days resumed, but something between them had shifted. They were no longer a widow and her servant. They were conspirators. 3 nights later, the dogs began to bark. Maeve woke with her heart pounding, the sound sharp and furious in the stillness. She reached for the lamp, her fingers fumbling with the match. Through the thin walls, she heard the unmistakable creak of boots on the front porch. Someone was there. Then, a knock. Slowed. 3 times. A voice drawled, low and smooth. "You awake?" Her blood went cold. She didn't recognize the voice, but somehow she already knew who it belonged to. Roch. Callan was outside in the small barn asleep, or so she prayed. Maeve stood frozen for what felt like forever, her hand gripping the lamp, her mind racing. The knock came again, harder this time. "Got word there's been some strange goings-on out this way," Roch said, his tone almost playful. "Judge don't like strange. You mind if I come in?" Maeve forced herself to speak. "It's late," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Come back in the morning." A long silence followed. Then came the slow, deliberate sound of boots moving off the porch. She heard him walking around the cabin, the crunch of his steps on the dry earth. Then, nothing. She stood there in the dark, her lamp flickering, listening so hard it hurt. Then, just when she thought he was gone, she heard it. A soft whisper through the wall, so close it felt like it was right behind her ear. "Tell the boy I said hello." Her scream caught in her throat. She dropped the lamp. The flame flared, then died, plunging the cabin into blackness. By the time dawn came, Roch was gone. But outside, in the soft mud by the well, were footprints that led nowhere, the tracks of a man who walked into the earth itself. When Calin saw them, his face went still. "It's begun," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he went to the barn and began packing what little they had. Maeve stood watching him, the rising sun washing the fields in pale gold. "Where will we go?" she whispered. He looked toward the distant line of trees where the swamp began. "Where the judge won't," he said, and with that, they left the only home she had ever known, the little farm shrinking behind them until it was just a smudge against the light. Neither spoke as they walked, the book hidden beneath her shawl, the air heavy with the scent of cypress and decay. Somewhere behind them, in the judge's grand house, a man awoke with a start, as if he had heard something break deep inside his dream. The game had changed, and for the first time, Judge Finch felt the faint chill of fear. There was no turning back. When Maeve reached the farm just before dawn, Calin was already there, standing outside the cabin, not in the barn where he should have been. His stance was tense, his gaze fixed on the road, as if he'd been standing guard through the night. When his eyes fell on the small book clutched in her trembling hands, something flickered across his face, an emotion she hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear or grief, but an overwhelming, fragile relief that almost broke her heart to witness. He stepped forward, taking the book gently from her, his fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly, her own voice unsteady. "Just tell me what we do now." Before he could respond, a dog began barking wildly in the distance, then another. The sound rolled across the fields like a warning bell. Calin's entire body went still. His head turned sharply toward the noise, his expression hardening into something cold and focused. "He's here," he said flatly. "Roch." He pressed the book back into her hands. "Listen carefully. There's a man. His name is Silas. He works the ferry at Black Creek Crossing. He's one of the few the judge doesn't control. Give him this book and tell him." Calin hesitated, then looked directly into her eyes. "Tell him the mockingbird is free." Maeve stared at him, confused and terrified. "What about you?" "The judge doesn't only want the book," Calin said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the dark line of trees behind the cabin. "He wants me." He drew a deep breath. "I'll draw Roch away. You'll have time to reach Silas. Go now." Before she could argue, he turned and sprinted toward the dense woods, vanishing into the tangled shadows. It was clear what he meant to do. He was sacrificing himself. For a heartbeat, Maeve stood frozen, clutching the book as his words echoed in her mind. Then the forest behind her erupted with the faint, rhythmic sounds of pursuit. Branches cracking, footsteps moving fast and silent. The hunter was closing in. She ran. She ran harder than she ever had in her life, her lungs burning, branches slashing at her arms and face. The forest blurred around her, a chaos of shadow and moonlight. She didn't know where the path was, only the direction of Black Creek. Behind her, the sounds of the chase never stopped. Not the clumsy thrash of a man running blindly, but the measured, deliberate rhythm of something hunting. She could hear Calin ahead, making noise deliberately, leading Roch away from her, keeping himself just close enough to be followed. The sky was beginning to pale when she finally stumbled out of the woods and onto the muddy bank of Black Creek. The air smelled of water and rot. A small wooden ferry waited at the edge, a crude raft pulled by ropes across the slow brown current. A grey-haired black man stood beside it, preparing for the morning's first crossing. "Silas," Maeve gasped, stumbling toward him. He turned, eyes sharp and alert. In an instant he took in her torn dress, her wild expression, and the small book clutched tightly against her chest. "Are you Silas?" she managed to choke out. "I am," he said, his deep voice calm but wary. "Calin sent me," she said, thrusting the book toward him. "He told me to give you this, and to tell you the mockingbird is free." Silas's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened with understanding. He took the book gently from her, nodding once. "Then it's begun," he said quietly. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The phrase was a code, one that meant Calin had put the final part of their plan into motion, knowing it would cost him everything. From across the water came a sound that cut through the mist, A single, sharp cry that ended abruptly. Maeve flinched, her blood turning to ice. She didn't need to be told what it meant. Silas's jaw tightened. "Get on the ferry, ma'am," he said urgently. He didn't wait for her to respond. He untied the thick rope and began hauling them across the river, his old muscles working with quiet strength. The water churned beneath them, the current tugging hard at the raft. Halfway across, Maeve turned. On the far bank, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. Roch, he stood at the edge of the water, tall and still, his long knife glinting faintly in the dawn light, its blade stained dark. His eyes followed them, cold and empty. He was too late. Maeve clutched the book to her chest as the ferry reached the far shore, her tears mixing with the mist. Callan was gone, but his secret, the truth, had survived. Maeve stared at the man across the river, the one who had just hunted, and likely killed, the boy she had bought for 17 cents. A sickening wave of grief and nausea rose in her throat, stealing the strength from her legs until she nearly collapsed. She realized she had been nothing more than a pawn in a cruel game she could never fully understand, a game that had already cost lives. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice ragged and hollow. Silas didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the far bank, his posture rigid, as though daring the tracker to try and cross. "Now," he said quietly, his tone heavy with a wary ancient sorrow, "the judge loses." He reached into his coat and pulled out the small, weathered book, holding it high for Roch to see across the wide stretch of water. A silent gesture of defiance, a promise that the story Judge Finch had tried to bury would not die with the boy. Roch didn't respond. He simply stood there for a long, taut moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and disappeared back into the trees, swallowed by the mist and the swamp. His mission was both completed and destroyed all at once. Silas and Maeve reached the far shore. The air felt different there, lighter somehow, as if they had crossed into another world where the judge's reach no longer extended. Silas secured the ferry line, then guided Maeve up a narrow trail through the reeds to a small, hidden cabin. Inside, an oil lamp cast a soft, amber glow over the plain wooden table and rough plank walls. Silas set the book down gently, almost reverently, like it was something sacred. "You're safe here for now," he said. Maeve's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Who are you, really?" Silas was silent for a long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice had taken on the weight of confession. "I knew Callan's mother," he said slowly, "before the judge bought her. We were from the same place in Virginia. I promised her I'd look after her boy." He paused, eyes distant. "But I failed. I stood by and did nothing for too long, too scared of what the judge could do." He looked down at his rough hands, then back at the book. "Callan knew I ran this ferry. He knew I had connections, people who help others vanish, people from what's now called the Underground Railroad. He reached out to me weeks ago, before all this began. He said he thought the judge had discovered his secret. We made a plan, desperate, but the only one we had. Getting him out was possible, but he refused to leave without proof." Silas tapped the book's cover. "Without this." He took a breath, his voice tightening. "He told me, a man's life is temporary, but the truth can outlive us. If someone's brave enough to protect it." He knew he probably wouldn't survive. "He made me swear that if he ever sent the signal, I'd take this book north, no matter what it cost." Silas looked up, meeting her eyes. He gave his life so that one day, the world would know what Judge Finch did to his own blood. Maeve's composure shattered. All the tears she had held back, the grief, the guilt, the fear, came flooding out in great, shuddering sobs. She wept for Callan, for the life stolen from him, for the love that had been buried beneath lies, and for the monstrous injustice that had poisoned everything it touched. Silas didn't speak. He simply sat there, silent and steady, a witness to her pain. When her sobs finally quieted, her body aching and hollow, Maeve looked at the book lying on the table, its leather darkened by time and sweat. "His wife," she whispered hoarsely. "The judge's daughter. What happened to her?" Silas's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "After the judge locked her away, he brought in a doctor from New Orleans, a man who claimed to treat women's hysteria. They declared her insane, said she was unfit, a danger to herself. He sent her to an asylum in Mobile, a place people go to disappear. She's a prisoner, just like Callan was." He paused, the words tasting like iron. The judge didn't just take her husband. He took her freedom, her mind, her name. The world believes Genevieve Finch had a breakdown and was sent away for her health. The story's neat, respectable, and entirely false. The cruelty of it made Maeve's stomach twist. It wasn't just murder, it was erasure, the destruction of a soul wrapped in the appearance of decency. The judge hadn't only destroyed Callan, he had obliterated his own daughter's existence, rewriting her into a ghost long before she was gone. Now Maeve understood. The 17 cents, the auction, the tracker, it had all been part of the judge's masterpiece of control. And she, an ignorant widow, had stumbled onto the stage and ruined his perfect ending. "What's in the book?" she finally asked, her voice barely more than breath. Silas opened it carefully, his weathered fingers turning the pages until he reached the back cover. There, in Callan's graceful handwriting, was the account of their secret marriage. The vows, the names, the night beneath the oak. And below the final line were 2 marks. One was Callan's signature. The other was not a name, but a small, dried smudge of reddish-brown, a thumbprint pressed in blood. "Genevieve's mark," Silas murmured, his tone filled with quiet reverence. "He told me about it. Proof that she entered their vows by her own choice. In the right hands, this book destroys everything the judge built. It exposes the lies, the theft charge he fabricated, the imprisonment of his own daughter to bury a truth he couldn't face." He closed the book slowly, as though sealing something sacred. "My contacts will see it reaches the abolitionist publishers in Philadelphia. They'll print it. The story will be told. It won't bring Callan back, and it may never free Genevieve, but it will fracture the judge's throne. It will start a fire he'll never be able to stamp out." Silas's gaze lifted to Maeve's. His expression was grave. "But you can never return to Augustine Parish. The judge won't stop hunting you. You're the loose end now, the one who knows everything." Maeve thought of her small Louisiana farm, the rows of sugarcane, her husband's grave under the oak, the quiet life that was gone forever. She had been swept away by a history she hadn't asked to touch. She was adrift, a refugee from a war no one would ever record. "Where will I go?" she asked softly, her words trembling. "North," Silas said. "We'll see you to safety. A new life." It's what he would have wanted. And so Maeve O'Connell vanished from Augustine Parish, guided by Silas and the silent, steadfast network of the Underground Railroad. She moved beneath moonlight, sleeping in barns and cellars, following whispered routes that led her northward until the swamps and Spanish moss were nothing but memory. She cut her hair, changed her name, and became someone new, a woman without a past. The book traveled with her, its pages guarded like a living flame, passed carefully from hand to hand until it reached Philadelphia. In the spring of 1850, an anonymous pamphlet began to appear on street corners and in taverns. It was titled A Parish of Lies. It told the story of a powerful Southern judge, his daughter, and the educated slave he destroyed to protect his name. The pamphlet never used the names, Judge Finch or Augustine Parish, but the details were sharp enough that everyone who mattered in Louisiana knew exactly whom it condemned. The press dismissed it as abolitionist propaganda, but the damage was done. The whispers began. A crack appeared in the judge's authority. Over time, his grip weakened. Judge Alistair Finch withdrew from public life, consumed by suspicion and fear. He spent a fortune chasing ghosts, trying to uncover the pamphlet's source, hunting for the widow who had disappeared. He never found her. The truth had escaped him, and once freed, it could not be recaptured. He died in 1863, not from a soldier's bullet, but from a stroke alone in his grand library, surrounded by the very books that had once framed his daughter's forbidden love. Servants later said that in his final years, he would scream at invisible figures, raging at shadows that bore his own name. Genevieve Finch remained confined to the asylum in Mobile for the rest of her life. She died in 1888. Officially, the cause was pneumonia, but the records noted that for 40 years she lived in unbroken silence. Whether it was the result of cruel treatments or her own refusal to speak, no one ever knew. She became the ghost her father had wanted her to be. Roch, the tracker, vanished into the swamps after that fateful night. The last mention of his name appeared in an 1854 sheriff's report, his bloated body found floating in a bayou. The report blamed an alligator, but rumors lingered that someone had evened a score. that justice had found him in the dark waters of Black Creek. Silas stayed at his ferry, an unremarkable man with a quiet purpose. He spent the rest of his life helping others escape to freedom, his own lifelong act of redemption. As for Kalin, his body was never found. Roch had likely buried him deep in the Louisiana swamp, lost forever to the mud and cypress roots. The judge had erased him in flesh, but not in memory. The story, the truth, endured. It became a whispered legend, a story passed in secret, reminding those who heard it that while men can silence voices, they cannot kill ideas. Bodies can be buried. Truth cannot. Maeve lived out her years in a small Ohio town, an old woman with kind eyes and a secret she never spoke aloud. When she died, they found a small, worn pamphlet locked in a wooden box beside her bed, a parish of lies. The story of the boy she bought for 17 cents. The boy who changed everything. A husband in secret. A rebel. A king in a world that refused to see him as either. If you travel to Augustine Parish today, you'll find no official record of what happened. The Finch name still adorns the courthouse and the library, etched into the stone of history written by those who won. But if you wander down to Black Creek Crossing, the locals might tell you a different story. They'll whisper of a ghost who roams the woods at night, searching for a lost book. They'll speak of a love that defied the law, and of a truth that demanded everything in return. If you've followed this far into the darkness, down this buried path of forgotten history, write "The Mockingbird is Free" below, because now you're not just hearing a story, you're keeping it. You're bearing witness to a truth that was meant to be erased. And that's a heavy thing to hold, isn't it? To carry knowledge the world tried to bury. The receipt for 17 cents still exists, tucked away in a university archive. Most who see it only recognize a grim artifact of cruelty, a record of a transaction from a brutal time. They see the numbers and shake their heads at the barbarity. But they don't see what you see. They don't feel the truth behind the ink. They don't know the story hidden within that paper. The ghost of a secret marriage, the fury of a powerful man desperate to preserve his illusion, or the courage of a woman who trusted a stranger. They think those 17 cents bought a slave. You know they bought a revolution, love and defiance bound together in blood and ink. That scrap of paper wasn't a record of ownership. It was a declaration of war, a war fought quietly, in coded letters, in hidden books, and in the hearts of people who refused to disappear. It reminds us that the truest histories often leave the faintest trails, that the stories most worth telling are the ones you must fight to uncover. The powerful tried to bury this one beneath their laws, their lies, and their pride. The world that made Judge Finch possible wasn't just built on laws, it was built on delusion. A system that turned human beings into property, that convinced men like Finch that ownership was divine right. It was a prison of the mind as much as the body. Kalin and Genevieve's crime was never theft, and it wasn't merely love. Their real offense was believing they were equal, that a bond between them could exist outside the world's cruel hierarchies. Their marriage wasn't just defiance, it was revelation. Because if a slave and a judge's daughter could be husband and wife, it meant the entire foundation of that society was a lie. It meant the walls of power were imaginary, and that the chains were not only on the enslaved, but on the enslavers too. The judge had to destroy them, not out of vengeance alone, but out of fear that the truth would shatter the fragile order that gave him meaning. His cruelty was self-preservation, an attempt to silence the proof that his kingdom was made of smoke and ghosts. And then there's Maeve, the quiet widow, perhaps the most important figure of all. She wasn't a hero or a revolutionary. She was ordinary. Someone who could have turned away, as so many do, and convinced herself it wasn't her fight. But she didn't. She saw the man, not the slave. She chose to believe, to trust, to act. Her courage wasn't grand or loud. It was simple and human. Running through the forest with a book she couldn't read, she carried a truth more powerful than the judge's wealth or wrath. She didn't just save a story, she saved meaning itself. Maeve reminds us that history doesn't always turn on kings or generals. Sometimes it pivots on the quiet, desperate choices of ordinary people. The choice to help, to listen, to run when everything tells you to hide. And as for Genevieve Finch, there's one last whisper about her. Some say that in the asylum at Mobile, the older nurses spoke of the silent woman in room 213. Every year, on April 11th, the date of the auction. She would find a scrap of charcoal or even use her own blood and draw on the wall of her cell. Always the same image. A mockingbird, its throat cut. A final act of mourning. A final act of truth. The asylum staff scrubbed the walls clean each time, desperate to erase the strange, sorrowful image. But year after year it returned, a haunting ritual of memory and defiance. That crude drawing became Genevieve Finch's last rebellion, her final way of speaking when her voice had long been taken from her. It was the ghost of her love, etched into stone and silence, a message to a world that had forgotten she ever existed. Even though her father had shattered her life, he had never managed to break her spirit. Somewhere deep inside, the love she bore for Calin still burned, untouched by 40 years of confinement and cruelty. That bird on the wall was her book now, written in blood and dust, a silent testament to the man they tried and failed to erase. Can you imagine a love so fierce it survives even the death of the mind itself? So why was this story buried so thoroughly? Why did generations of scholars and archivists who stumbled upon its traces choose to turn away? Because this isn't just the story of one corrupt judge. It's an indictment of the entire system that sustained him. It exposes the law not as a tool of justice, but as a weapon of control. It reveals how bureaucracy, dressed in civility, can commit acts of monstrous evil while pretending to uphold order. That's why this story is dangerous. It reminds us that the official record, the receipts, the court rulings, the ledgers of property, are not always truth. They are often just the version written by the powerful. The real history survives in whispers, in forbidden pamphlets, in rumors, in the charcoal marks on an asylum wall. The real history is what they tried to destroy. The sale of Calin for 17 cents wasn't just cruel. It was blasphemous. It turned value itself into a weapon. It was meant to prove that a human being could be measured, priced, and declared worthless. It was an act of spiritual annihilation masquerading as a financial transaction. But they were wrong. His worth could never be contained in coins. His life was beyond price. The proof of that is simple. We are here now, more than a century later, uncovering his story and breathing life back into his name. We are the echo he died to create. That feeling you have right now, the chill, the ache, the quiet fury, that's the point. Stories like this are not meant to soothe you. They're meant to wake something within you, to remind you that the world is built on stories, and many of them are deliberate lies. The history, we're taught, is a carefully curated museum of power, displaying only what flatters the victors. The true history, the one that matters, is a haunted house. It's filled with the ghosts of those who were silenced, erased, or rewritten out of existence. Their voices still linger, in the soil, in the archives, in the walls, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The story of Calin, Genevieve, and the widow who bought him for 17 cents isn't just a tragedy from another century. It's a key, a dangerous one. It unlocks the question we all fear to ask: what else has been buried? What other ghosts are still waiting to be heard? We live surrounded by the aftermath of secrets. Our world is shaped by silent wars fought long before our birth. This story is just one fragment of that hidden history, one ghost finally given a voice. That morning in Augustine Parish, Judge Alistair Finch thought he was writing an ending. He believed himself the author, using law, money, and fear as his ink. He imagined he had created a masterpiece of silence, a story scrubbed clean of defiance. But he made one fatal error. He forgot that real stories aren't written on paper. They are written on the human heart. And the heart remembers. No law can erase it. No archive can contain it. No passage of time can truly silence it. He thought he was closing a book. But all he did was create a ghost, one that has haunted the edges of history for nearly 2 centuries, waiting for someone to finally speak its name. He wanted to prove a man could be worth 17 cents. Instead, he proved that love, truth, and courage are worth everything. Now you know.